Well, hello everyone, and welcome to what is, I think, the fourth session of this year's Create HDR series. My name's Sue Olovich, and it's a real pleasure to be with you today and to host what I know will be a really inspiring and insightful session together. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I'm joining you from today, the land of the Darawal people, and I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge and honour the rich cultural traditions of storytelling, music, dance, and visual art that First Nations people have practiced for millennia. And these practices are not just creative expressions, they are living, breathing knowledge systems that connect community, country, and culture in really profound ways. And I'd also like to extend deep respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are joining us either today or tuning in via the recording. So feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. You might like to acknowledge the land you're joining us from today. And it's a really lovely way for us to connect across the spaces that we're learning in. So today, I know our presentation promises to be a really fascinating one. I think Jenny's going to encourage us to really explore possibility and to press the margins, I guess, in what she's exploring today. As Jenny's presenting, I really encourage you to pop any thoughts or questions or ideas, curiosities into the chat as they come up. And we'll circle back to those at the end of the session when we have time to discuss through questions and answers. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jenny Sesta. Jenny is a passionate educator and researcher whose career spans roles as a primary school teacher, education consultant, and pre-service teacher educator. Driven by a deep curiosity about literacy learning lives of children, Jenny's work explores how everyday moments in classrooms can inspire transformative pedagogical practices. Her research focuses on thinking with post-foundational approaches to challenge conventional theories and generate innovative, socially just frameworks for teaching and learning. With a commitment to reimagining education, Jenny seeks to uncover creative ways to analyse and narrate the complexities of children's literacy experiences, fostering equity and inclusivity in research and pedagogy. So thrilled that Jenny could join us today. And the title of today's presentation is Reimagining Research and Pedagogy, Provocations for Thinking Otherwise. Jenny, we're really thrilled that you're able to join us today. And thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I'll throw over to you now to start the session.
Thank you all so much for your time today. As I take you through, I guess I could say layers of stories and upon stories, or, ways I sought to reimagine what could be for my qualitative research study. And, my study is situated in the early years primary school classroom. But I wonder what possibilities might be here for you, and I've tried to work some of those in throughout the presentation. So I really look forward to you thinking along with me as we work through some of these ideas, and appreciate your time in doing so. So provocations for thinking otherwise. Despite wherever you're researching, the nature of your research, what are some ways that can kind of agitate and inspire us to theorize the everyday, let's say, to reimagine what might be made possible? So my area of interest was really contesting some of the practices within the early years literacy classroom that are increasingly becoming narrow and narrow and have profound implications for issues of social justice, especially for the child who took centre stage in my study, Grace. And I looked at Grace and I analysed her experiences of being placed in a low ability group. And I, in a minor research study, took a more traditional rather approach to kind of looking at themes and probably undertaking sort of analysis that was more in a coded way and sort of narrating some of the injustices of that. So for my larger study, I wanted to bring into play much more expansive concepts, much more expansive ways to generate more creative narratives about Grace's experiences. So a little bit of context there, and we'll have a look throughout the presentation at ways that I also represented, if you like, words on a page. My thesis was presented using autoethnographic narratives, vignettes, stories there. So my interest was in words and language and all the rest of it. Others I know might have other creative productions and so on in their research. But I want to suggest some ways for provoking and thinking with the use of words and so on as we move through, make a bit more sense. So I start with this really broad, seemingly simple question. What is it that we pay attention to in our research worlds? For me, undertaking quite a traditional minor thesis, I was looking at issues of power, social justice, knowledge, and issues of equity in the early years literacy classroom, and continue to do that in my larger study. But I wanted to pay attention to a lot more. I wanted to bring in, for Grace, this young learner, what was the feeling of literacy? Aside from critiquing a lot of the approaches and practices. So that notion of paying attention, is a simple one, but I encourage you to think of, well, what's coming into play, in my research? What key ideas will I, think about? And that second question there, how might you reimagine your research and ways to write your research in new ways? So the focus for today, and of course these 4 areas are strongly interconnected there, was to share some of the philosophical ideas that I found in postfoundational approaches. A huge area of diverse methodologies that cross disciplines, that, owe a lot to Indigenous scholarship, decolonising methodologies, posthumanism, post-qualitative studies, the posts, so a vast area there. So I've just selected a bit of a snapshot to focus on today. And this notion of using concepts that you put to work that are going to be used to generate creativity, that are going to work in a diversity of ways there. And threaded through, I'll suggest some ways that I tried to disrupt linear writing and insert some new ways for writing or language that has a performative function, if you like. And again, right through, I've got some researchers that have helped me and continue to help me to think in different ways and continue to really challenge me also. So that's kind of what the focus is today. So I'll talk a little about Grace in a moment, but in my traditional approach to research, I was, studiously trying to prepare my research question, trying to get it right. I don't know whether any of this will resonate with you. Spending endless hours, maybe days, over periods, sitting in class, everyone's saying, what's your research question? Trying to determine what it was before I undertook the research, which, I found just didn't work for me. So some of the ideas today we're going to talk about kind of really lend themselves to questions being emergent and thinking about research that may not start here, then go there in those locked stages. So this research question there evolved after I sort of got over that notion that it had to come before my analysis and all the rest of it. I hope this is making sense, but it's one I landed on and I stand by in terms of my areas of interest. What is it that children learn about the world themselves and what they may aspire to in the neoliberally configured literacy classroom? So there's a lot there. And so that was the essence of my research and using the story, the powerful experiences and ways of narrating my young learner Grace and her life there, and especially this notion of what are children learning they are able to aspire to there. and the impending, the ever-present neoliberally driven directives and focus on individuality, competition, and how those are seeping in so profoundly in our everyday teaching worlds that have real impacts and implications for issues of social justice. And that second question there was the reimagining part. So how can these ideas, attune us, make us aware, wake us up, to more socially just literacy pedagogies? I've called this slide Meet Grace. Grace became the object of measurement once entering that classroom. And I must say, of course, schools vary. Not all schools are jumping on children and measuring their reading levels the minute they walk in the door. However, increasingly, this seems to be taking over, this incessant need to measure children and to make that just a priority, get them ahead, lift their levels, just themes and topics I sort of went to town on in my thesis in terms of critiquing and contesting that. And so young Grace was the subject of very narrow measurements. You'll see some of those dot points there, determined to be unable to read, below expected level, needing remediation, and assigned to a low ability group. Actually, this one was in the centre of the classroom with 3 other boys deemed to be at risk, struggling, and pretty much living a life what Comer and Hayes would call fickle literacies, decodable texts, very simplified language, very dumbed down, sort of dull pedagogies, as Pat Thompson might describe them. And I wanted to explore not only Grace the human child, even though these practices were dehumanising, but I really wanted to analyse all of these other more than human aspects of Grace's learning life. And I played a bit with these symbols and, the over-reliance on checklists. So I kind of put interludes in my thesis that sort of stopped and sort of performed kind of different kind of work, if that makes sense. So critiquing neoliberal kind of expectations, demands, and, really wanting to think so much more beyond Grace as that human child, even though she was hardly being treated in a human kind of way, because she really was considered below, separate, and so on. I really love this quote by Deborah Hayes and colleagues, Australian researchers who have been researching social justice, schools, issues in schools for many years. And they suggest, well, how might we bring fresh insights to the enduring problem of inequality, particularly how schools function in ways that reproduce inequalities through everyday relations and practices. And this quote just seemed to just sort of embody what I was thinking about. There's such amazing work out there in the field of critical pedagogy and expanding ways that we can think about problems of inequities that seem to be so effortlessly reproduced. And that notion of everyday relations and practices was one I was interested in, because often teachers, school leaders, pull students aside, have students in low ability groups or at-risk groups with great intentions, but wanting to keep alive other ways that these are affecting our children. So, look, a large part of my thesis was, the work of Stephen Ball, who has been critiquing the impact of neoliberalism on education for many years. And I wanted to critique and resist there, which I did a lot of in my minor thesis and continue to in my larger study. But it was the reimagining alternatives. It was the reimagining ways of narrating Grace's learning and her experiences that became of interest, especially in my study. And so I explored, ways in which researchers were looking at this notion of deficit and children being positioned as, deficit, not good enough, and Russell Bishop's work in New Zealand and, his terms, pathologizing practices, pathologizing children, was really interesting to look at. And I started to, again, playing with language here just to show you some of the ways that, I represented grace in different forms of texts and, grace, the low child, the child who struggles, and so on there, thinking of Grace's experiences, Grace's inability to recall information in a literacy classroom that was really conceptualized as just being around recalling facts, memorizing facts. So I theorized Grace in lots of different ways, and I started to write into some of these areas here. I'll talk about a couple of those as we move through and use a couple of concepts, but rather than kind of waiting for the end of any sort of analysis, I had this amazing supervisor who just said, go and write, keep writing, play with ideas, and, then pause, have a look at what's happening, and then link it with your theories and concepts and so on. So, that notion of crossing words out, putting things under erasure was just one of the many sort of techniques I played with that might be of interest to you also. And I thought of Grace and just Grace as, all that was needed was her memory, her capacity to recall facts, which, obviously this year in her learning life didn't make the cut. I started to explore some posthuman researchers like Karen Morris, who talks about brains on sticks and how dehumanizing some of the ways we treat children are, and how Grace's body was completely erased from any notion of what it meant to be, a learner who had the potential, had the capacity to bring a rich array of experiences and knowledge, but was pretty much not considered there. So from those areas, if you like, of contestation, of challenging, of filling me often with lots of bouts of despair, and still do, writing becomes so entangled with personal expression, as well as conceptual, as well as, theoretical, academic. And so I wanted my thesis to produce, narratives of grace, narratives of classroom learning life, to be as complex as that. I didn't want to kind of leave out all the messy, hard stuff, but that challenged me. So I wanted to share with you some of the concepts and some of the ways that I worked into some of those tensions, and some of those areas of passion too that kept me curious and intrigued. And so I'd heard this term postfoundational for a while from my supervisor. And it wasn't until this text came out from Maziah Jackson, it's an edited text that really, and it came out kind of a good year or maybe a year and a half after I'd formally started my research study. And it just encompassed just so many diverse perspectives, and that huge umbrella term, post-foundational approaches. We can think of it bringing into play post-structuralism, new materialism, feminist new materialism, post-humanism. There are diverse arrays of theories and philosophies there. If you are, interested in exploring some of those, I would suggest, start here, have a look at them. And a few, this slide hardly represents the beautiful ideas and complexity of ideas in that text. However, for us today, essentially they are challenging foundations, the notion of that, single discoverable truth. And, I look back on my first minor study And I kind of smiled to myself because I remember standing in the study thinking, do I have enough data to prove what I'm saying? And I mean, that's where I was at. And so this kind of philosophical way of approaching my research kind of was making sense, even though it was very complex. Is research about proving claims? Is it about finding the truth with capital T? And of course, when we're talking about reimagining research and writing in more creative ways, ontologies that are concerned with movement, change, process, and relations, we're conceptualizing a world that's constantly in flux, constantly moving. And that's the kind of thinking I wanted to bring to the classroom as well. And especially I want to feel like every day is about contesting this idea that literacy is this set of, progress skills that need to be taught one bit after another, that need to be mastered, that it's settled, that aspects of that, yes, have a place, but any kind of approach to let's keep it with literacy that dictates that there's one way of doing it is really, really concerning. And I see, the classrooms I'm visiting now, wow, talk about disembodied. It's all about the content. And so in terms of issues of marginalisation, children who are not remembering facts or retaining facts, I'd argue all children, but those are really, of concern. And we're questioning in these accounts, whose knowledge is valued, who gets to say what literacy is, or who gets to define this. And Elizabeth St. Pierre has an excellent chapter, in my opinion, there on challenging, the human, like whose knowledge is valued. It's generally Eurocentric Enlightenment thinking that, is always about representation. Literacy is this, therefore, it needs to be taught this way. And so these kinds of ideas that immersed me in post-foundational approaches, really nicely married with critical ideas also. And what they also enabled was a rethinking of what are the boundaries that really limit what we can think about. And again, just in my experience, that, idea that I write the research question first, there's that category, then I produce the research, then I, prove my claims and so on, was very limiting in terms of what could be produced and what could be imagined. So that rethinking boundaries that, really are so fixed and stuck was a really important part of this. And it led me to this notion of thinking with and beyond the human and using ideas from posthumanism and work of Barad and so on to think about Grace's learning life. And a couple of particular areas that, I think are beautifully outlined in this text. Research is imagined as enactments, it's senses, it's doings, and they're activated by concepts in processes of thinking with. And I wonder if that resonates with you in terms of the kinds of areas that you're interested in research. When research becomes, in my experience again, from this set of facts or claims I have to somehow prove, to being much more attuned to what I'm sensing, that they're enactments, that they are imbued with change and possibility, then it invites such different orientations to your processes of thinking and writing and so on. And I guess I just kind of alluded to this. We're oriented to different attunements that make something else possible. So what else is possible for Grace? What else can be made possible for children, for teachers in these very restrictive learning worlds? And so I really like this notion of thinking about concepts. And again, this is moving from knowledge that is something that is proven and only credible if it, somehow has all these trails of evidence, which, mind you, are created and invented by humans anyhow. But I love this notion of thinking about concepts and what they can produce, because it kind of opens up what can be made possible. And I found myself in all sorts of places, literacy education, absolutely, but I found myself going into lots of different spaces and disciplines to be thinking about issues in literacy education. As I mentioned before, much more attuned to our human and more than human world. And a strange learning, or, provocation for me was reading Rosie Braidotti's posthuman knowledge and her work. And she talks about the missing people of humanism. And I started to imagine Grace as, marginalised. Is Grace a missing child of the classroom? And so all those concepts sort of came into play. And, posthumanists, I was reading posthumanisms and approaches to that. Researchers are expressing concerns that, we're getting rid of the human. But I found, like a strange way that it just heightened our humanness more than ever, if that kind of makes sense there. So let us have a look at some of these concepts. I've got a few I chose for you and that I kind of put to work in this PowerPoint presentation that helped me reimagine. It's a bit of a snapshot of those. So I'm going to talk to you about how I, used entanglement, the concept of assemblages, agency and effect. And as I mentioned before, I think I said they challenged me and they still challenge me. And what I got better at was trying to understand the context and the philosophies that some of these concepts had their kind of genealogies in or were used in, if that even makes sense. I'm not sure about that. But, assemblages there has been conceptualised, all of them, in lots of different ways by different researchers. So again, back to Jackson and Mazzei, I promise you I do not work for Routledge, but these publications, I just had a look today and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not a rep for Routledge, but they happen to all be produced by Routledge, except for the Berard text there. But this text there, Thinking with Theory and Qualitative Research, second edition, Jackson and Mazzei, putting various concepts to work and using data, not calling it data, but using it in such interesting and imaginative ways, but also marrying it with philosophies and ideas there in their research with early academics. So nice one there. In particular for me was the chapter on Berard. And you can see there on the other side the effect in literacy teaching, learning and teaching, and posthumanism and literacy education, just constantly close, looking at the ways others were using some of these complex ideas and, just going through, looking at how they're analysed in classroom life, looking at how they're thinking and entangling ideas. Still doing it, by no means finished, but again, going back and rereading and returning to some of those areas, strongly recommend if these are of interest to you. Obviously, the literacy ones, perhaps if you're not in the literacy space, but this glossary for doing post-qualitative, new materialist and critical posthumanist research across disciplines, wow, that's a long title. Another really interesting edited collection there, and unpacks a lot of these concepts there. So a really great place to start too. Finding myself in a very unexpected place of quantum physics in Berard's Meeting the Universe Halfway, concepts still elude me. However, I got really good at reading ways other researchers were using these ideas, and yes, directly quoting some of Berard's work, but still wrestling with some of the ideas. So again, some texts that can be of use to you there. So let's take a look at some of these concepts and some suggestions, I guess, that might be of use for you in your research. And so thinking with entanglement, as I mentioned before, philosophies that see us humans as being, just so tightly entangled, not separate identities, had me thinking about grace and, the neoliberalist view of learning that was very much individualized, where bodies were separated, spaces were separated, specific objects, decodable texts were or could be theorized as coming into play. That really produced conditions of impossibility and possibility for grace. And I started to incorporate more of an expansive approach to bodies, beyond human bodies, that, bodies of knowledge. So I thought a lot about how literacy, pedagogy, programs as an actual body that moves through time and space, that has different implications for how it is, realised in the literacy classroom. So looking for ways to restory classroom life as entangled, and constantly being curious about what else might come into play. What else is there that we often leave out and that we, could be really attuned to think differently. So I have a few of those possible what else's, if you like, entities, elements, arguably could be many, many different elements of Grace's learning life. And, if you think about your own research and what you might bring into play beyond the human, I really sought to analyse Grace's learning experiences by taking account of specific literacy practices, the reading level, immersed in the headlines and the constant perpetuation that our standards are going down. Those of you familiar with the literacy wars, a body expanding. This is this body that somehow continues to haunt our educational landscape. Education department policies, where in Victoria these are being felt. Wow. Visiting some schools recently and seeing how policies are taking hold of how we teach, how children learn in really reductive ways. Sounds, it's something, the sounds aspect. Children, I would hear them saying, oh, they do easy work over there. Grace hearing those. The sounds in terms of that group expected to work quietly and so on. The precarious conditions in Grace's life. And imagine or theorise how disenchanted her physical body was as she was expected to operate and move within this classroom space, away from her peers. I remember one day watching her engaging and laughing with someone in the room, and then she was called away from that to sit at her withdrawal table. Interesting name. And the dull, repetitive tasks. So yes, sometimes this work is a bit emotional, but I really, just to get back to the notion of entanglement, I really wanted to bring, what has been theorised as assemblages. And if you can imagine all of these forces, flows, circulating in classroom life, they shift, they move. So there is potential there for other possibilities for our Grace. And the notion of agency is being beyond the human. Often hear the term, I'm going to build agency in that child. I'm going to develop approaches where there's, agency. Nothing wrong with that at all. But in new materialism and in the ideas I explored, especially Jane Bennett's notion of thing power, agency can be attributed to the more than human, because if we imagine them as lively, if we imagine them as vibrant, they perform. They have real life implications when obviously assembled with other ideas. And so I wonder, and I know the lovely Katie there in music education, and thinking about what might come into play in my analysis and my writing and my narratives about how children learn or how we relate with our more than human objects and materials. And I'm suggesting there, which was a key question for me, how are these supposed inanimate, yet very powerful objects, especially in literacy, making life intelligible for the at-risk learner, for the teacher. And those of you perhaps not in literacy education, there on the left are books that are coded and, well, color coded here, but often they are numbered, and children, you sometimes hear them running around saying, I'm a level 8, I'm a level 2, and, quite problematic there. And so thinking about how the withdrawal table, all of those areas come into play. And so bringing into play affect theory, and Sue had me thinking of, I didn't have this definition in, I had some sort of other ideas, and I thought I'd really love to share with you what I think is a really beautiful definition by a researcher called Hayden Lorimer, who is a cultural geographer. I told you I found myself in very unexpected places. And he describes affects or affects as properties, competencies, modalities, energies, attunements, arrangements, and intensities of different texture, temporality, velocity, and spatiality that acts on bodies, are produced by bodies and transmitted by bodies. Yes, an absolute mouthful, but if you're a lover of language and words, as I am, I just love the flows, the impact of those words, the idea that all of that is circulating in our everyday worlds. And after completing my PhD, I'm so much more attuned to this in, working with precept service teachers, walking into the staff room, like trying to get a feel for atmospheres. And as I said, I wanted to share that one with you and have you thinking around, especially in creative spaces and arts-based pedagogies. Learning this language was very challenging for me, and it kind of transformed me in a way that it changed the way I wrote, because there's a movement and a freedom to this language and how it, the aesthetic quality of it and how it makes you feel. And I started to make connections with the decodable text that Grace, was pretty much the diet of her life. And I thought, again, kind of making all of those connections there, the agency of words, the agency of those texts that really did not produce that beauty and possibility in Grace's literacy learning. So a definition there for you. And again, I wanted to share so much with you, but Anna Hickey Moody's research there, also in this Deleuze and research methodology edited collection, chapter 11. I could send it to you if you really want, but she has developed this notion of affective pedagogies, and gosh, her work is just incredible and inspiring. And she got me thinking about, expanding the notion of what bodies do, what they are, and how embodied capacities can be increased or decreased by the atmospheres of school life. So how our atmospheres can profoundly shape what we become attached to, really our ethical concerns. And this expression she used, I really just hung on to and really loved that. Thinking of Grace, what are the residues of experiences for Grace that will live on in her thoughts and in her body, and kind of thinking so very differently beyond just Grace and what I observe, getting into that nature of feeling and intensities and the flows of classroom life, if you like. And so I did a fair bit of writing around this notion of Grace being haunted, and I looked at Avery Gordon's work and so Lisa Blackman and so many other researchers looking at hauntings and especially in terms of intergenerational trauma and words like spectres and traces and atmospheres are all kind of co-implicated in our capacity to act and how atmospheres create conditions, real conditions that leave marks on us, for better or for worse, if you like. And just some, atmospheres of exclusion. Grace's capacity to act was diminished by neoliberal desires, I argued. And I theorized that any sense of Grace having this enriching, experience of belonging was cruelly erased. And my last chapter was a reckoning with the ghosts of neoliberalism, and it helped me really bring into play. My former critique of neoliberalism was pretty much, this, and this. This is, why it's, excluding. This is the impact of it. But I started to sort of generate different kinds of narratives using some of these theories, and the work of Ben Anderson there helped me think about neoliberal effects and so on. So, reimagining grace, and I've generally, talked about grace in that withdrawal group. But, the year after my observations of grace in that group, Grace came into my classroom, and I spent a chapter analysing such small, ordinary practices that I implemented with Grace that, kind of emerged in lots of different ways for Grace to become a literacy learner. So I theorised that Grace was so much more than that isolated, struggling individual body was being assessed and, measured in various ways, but she was dynamically interconnected and shaped by the intensities, flows, and forces that charge the atmosphere. I theorised about the ways in which children, and their bodies are profoundly shaped by these atmospheres, what they carry, traces of shame, pleasure, vitality. And what I came to was this ethics of the moment. There's possibilities that reside in that moment of, choices we might make in how, we pay attention to concerns, especially with vulnerable children, and in schools generally where we can get very rushed, we can be taken over by top-down mandates, but it's kind of arguing for this ethics of the now and an immersion of that into our pedagogical lives, and bringing in diverse human and more than human elements, and arguing that in those assemblages they absolutely produce opportunities, inclusions, or conversely, exclusions. And so just to finish up now, and apologies, Sue, I'm not sure how we're going for time, but just want to share a few texts that could be of interest to you there, and ways that these philosophies help me to write differently. I used narrative methods, autoethnography. I couldn't keep the personal out. I couldn't imagine how. I never aspired to be the detached observer who was out to prove. Objective research, I was in this, Grace was in this, we're all in this. And so there were moments of deeply personal writing. So the Handbook of Autoethnography, again, such beautifully heartfelt stories. However, do not misunderstand, that critical edge is driven right through those. And autoethnography as a methodology, always for me has that, deeply critical edge, that looking at the intersection of personal and cultural concerns, but with that, determined focus on critiquing and improving worlds. Bronwyn Davies, I want to say this is possibly one of my favourite books of all time. They're a researcher, that I first got interested in, many years ago, over 30 years ago, when I first had my child, frogs and snails and puppy dog. tales, or no, feminist tales, Bronwyn Davies' early work, and finding her again in my research project was just inspiring. And lots of, you can see the title there, Entanglement, lots of ways that, yeah, she brings in the more than human. I'm simplifying it, but some really great, rich stories there. And writing in the articulation of post-qualitative research, that edited collection, in particular, Nikki Fairchild's writing, just really inspired me to play with text, to mess around, to make my texts, perform in certain ways. Really great collection there. And post-human research practices again. Carol A. Taylor as a researcher, just really inspiring stuff. So you can see a few dot points there, creating narrative textual assemblages. I went from thinking this is chapter 1, this is chapter 2, to still having chapters, but taking what Suzanne Gannon calls textual detours, feeling okay with doing that, experimenting with writing. There's still this fiercely academic, theoretical component, but really arguing for those to be immersed, to be entangled. And I popped in different kinds of approaches to writing. I didn't know how to start my thesis, so I thought I'd write a letter to my examiners and to my readers, to sort of signal to them, hey, do you want to come along with me? This is what I'm on about. Fortunately, they came along with me, thank goodness. And I popped in lots of what were called affective scratches, just interludes, little detours from an idea from Bessie Dernekos, her work, and just zigzagging and mixing up the thesis to disrupt, those flows and to sort of encourage the reader to make those new connectives also.
Jenny, thank you so much for an absolutely beautiful presentation. I almost need time to pause to get my thoughts together.
No worries. No worries at all.
I have some questions, but I particularly valued the opportunity to be introduced to Grace, and the profoundly moving way that you shared her experience and the research journey that you went on alongside her, but also the generosity with which you've shared your thinking, your challenges, your journey, but also your resources. And I know for many of us will find those invaluable. So thank you so much. What a beautiful presentation, Jenny. I'm really, really moved by it. Katie looks like she's unmuted there.
Yep. Thanks, Jenny. Really, just the timing of your presentation and your thoughts is really perfect for me as I look into, I guess, the study that I'm going to be doing for my PhD. And thinking about, I've been making notes as you've been talking, but I'm thinking now about the idea of thinking with fits in quite well with the possibility of me doing an action research approach in my doc.
Can I thank you, Jenny, on behalf of all of us for a really deeply insightful and profoundly moving presentation today. I'm going away with lots to think about and some wonderful resources under my arm now to further explore. But I know I speak for all of us here today. It's been a wonderful opportunity to have the presentation from you, and we thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and lovely to see you all.
Take care, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in a month's time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye, everyone.